For 22 years I have made a life out of listening, not in the poetic sense, but in the procedural one, passing sonograms, marking decibel peaks, isolating harmonics. I am a bioacoustics researcher, and my career has been defined by the conviction that e-sound has a source. Echo, no matter how faint, is a reflection of matter against matter. There are no exceptions. The routine comforts me. Each morning, before the sun burns away the fog that coils around the cliffside, I walk the narrow concrete corridors of the naval station. The walls sweat with salt from the ocean air, paint blistering in long vertical streaks. The fluorescents overhead buzz with the constancy of insects. Their hum fuses with the endless undertow of the sea below. I keep my steps measured, my thermos of coffee hot against my palm, and my mind already calculating the day's calibrations. In the laboratory, the soundproof chamber is a geometry of silence. Foam wedges line the walls like the ribs of some vast grey beast, swallowing stray reverberations before they can contaminate a recording. I test the hydrophones, sensitive microphones designed to capture underwater frequencies, running sweeps across the audible spectrum. The machines respond with obedient green spikes across the monitors, a language I have learned to read as fluently as print. My reputation rests on this discipline. No claim, no anomaly has ever passed from my desk without exhaustive verification. Superstition is an indulgence I cannot afford, nor do I desire it. I publish numbers, not folklore. The younger researchers sometimes mock my meticulousness, triple-checking cables, recalibrating spectrogram software deep into the night. But they forget that one compromised datum can corrupt years of fieldwork. There is isolation in this kind of work. The nearest town lies 40 minutes inland, its glow barely reaching us through the coastal mist. Nights belong to the ocean, a constant roar, low and unending, pressing against the windows like a reminder that our lives here are provisional. I sometimes wonder if the sea is indifferent to our instruments, or faintly amused by them, but I press such thoughts aside. A disciplined mind is a seawall against speculation. Protocol is my anchor. I tell myself this as I slide the day's first reel into the archive vault. Shelves stacked with decades of preserved signals. The ocean speaks in patterns. My duty is only to decode them, never to embellish them. I believed this with the certainty of bone. I did not yet know how quickly that certainty would corrode. It began, as anomalies often do, with something I almost overlooked. The hydrophones were running their usual longitudinal study, a 24-hour capture of whale song patterns as they migrated past the station. I had been cataloguing humpback moans, low-frequency clicks, and the occasional sharp interference from naval vessels. The data fell into expected ranges, spectral fingerprints I could have recognized blind. Then, at 02.17 hours, a pattern appeared that refused to behave. At first, it was a smear of resonance in the subsonic band, far below the threshold of human hearing. The monitor translated it into a jagged set of peaks, unlike any cetacean vocalization I had seen. The harmonics were too clean, too evenly spaced. I marked the file for closer review. When I slowed the playback and shifted the spectrum upward, the room changed. Out of the speakers bled a sound with formants, the resonant peaks that shape vowels in speech. My blood thinned as I realized what I was hearing. It was not a whale. It was not a ship. It was closer to us. It carried the skeletal frame of a human voice, stretched and buried in frequencies no throat could reach. Dr. Annika Rao, the pathology resident assigned to my lab for her exchange, happened to be present. She had been organizing tissue sample reports at the side desk, her white coat sleeves rolled to the elbow. She leaned back, frowned, and said, "Glitch in the software. Probably a bleed from the digital filters." I didn't respond immediately. Protocol required verification. I replayed the sample. Then again, from a second hydrophone. then from a third array positioned a full kilometre away. Each returned the same impossible pattern. Not a glitch, I said finally. 3 separate arrays. Independent confirmation, Rao tilted her head. Then maybe it's an artifact, a miscalibration. Could be interference from a trawler. Her dismissal irritated me more than it should have. I took her through the basics, carefully, as if explaining to a first-year student. Hydrophones work by converting pressure waves in water into electrical signals. Echoes form when those waves strike a solid surface and return. What we are seeing here is not an echo. It is originating within the water column itself. She shrugged, unconvinced. Still doesn't mean it's a voice. But my skin knew otherwise. The vowels were crude, distorted, but they were there. I saved the spectrogram and stared at the pattern. Formant structures, those peaks and valleys, were arranged in the exact sequence of human articulation. Impossible, because human voices require air-filled cavities, vocal cords, tongues, and lips. 3,000 meters below sea level, there is only crushing black water. At that depth, a human body would collapse before lungs could draw a single note. The absurdity of it was almost comic. It was like hearing a heartbeat inside a stone wall, a physiological signal trapped where life could not exist. Yet there it was, pulsing across my screen. Hours later, long after Rao had retired to the barracks, I remained in the lab. The facility around me seemed to hollow itself into silence. The fluorescents hummed, the tape reels clicked. Beyond the slit windows, fog pressed against the glass, muting the ocean's roar. I filtered the anomaly further, isolating frequencies, stripping noise. Each adjustment made the shape clearer, and then I heard it. My name, not clean, not perfect, but close enough that the marrow in my bones seemed to vibrate with it. The sound did not reflect me. It anticipated me, as if the ocean had spoken first. I replayed it again and again, until exhaustion blurred the edges of the room. Rational thought told me it was coincidence, pareidolia, the brain imposing order on noise. But protocol gnawed at me. 3 arrays, triple confirmation. The data was real. When I finally left the chamber, the fog in the corridor seemed thicker than before. My name still hung in my ears not as an echo, but as an address. And I knew with cold certainty that the sea had begun listening back. By morning, the fog had thickened into a kind of weathered plaster over the sea, sealing the horizon at arm's length. I returned to the lab with the same thermos, the same circuits of routine, and the one deviation I never allow. I locked the door from the inside. Not to exclude anyone, I told myself, but to exclude noise. Contamination can arrive as footsteps, as casual conversation, as the faint metallic jingle of keys. I needed a sterile environment, acoustically and psychologically. First pass, I rebuilt the data set from raw. No filters, no corrections, only timestamps and array IDs. I stacked the 3 hydrophone captures vertically and synchronized them by GPS clock. Time alignment is simple in principle. Match the millisecond stamps, yet crucial. If signals line up across distant sensors, the phenomenon is not a local glitch, but a field event. On the screens, the spectrograms lay like 3 translucent quilts, their colored bands in rough concordance. When I cross-correlated the sequences, a mathematical way of asking how similar 2 signals are, the peaks rose together like 3 fingers through water. I spoke aloud, though the room was empty, not reflected, field-generated. The distinction matters. An echo implies a source and a surface. Sound out, sound back. A field-generated signal means the energy appears within the medium itself. Imagine watching ripples form in a still bowl without a stone falling in. That is the difference. Rao knocked at 0810 and let herself in, unapologetic about the lock. "You look like you slept on the console," she said, then softened. "Any luck disproving yourself?" I gestured her closer. "Observe the delay differentials." The term was a slab of granite. I saw her expression harden against it. So I translated. Each array is in a different location. If a single object made this sound, the waves would reach each array at slightly different times, like thunder reaching 3 people standing apart. These are not behaving like that. The timing says the signal begins everywhere between the arrays, as though the water is vibrating in place. She folded her arms. Cavitation, microbubbles. I've read about strange tone bursts when propellers shear the water. Cavitation produces chaotic broadband noise, I said. This is structured. I zoomed into the formants, the laddered bands that, in human mouths, shape vowels. And it's anticipatory. I played the clip in which my name surfaced, then advanced the waveform by 10 milliseconds. 20. The syllabic bulges rose a breath before my recorded intake of air. Rao leaned over the speakers, as if that might alter the physics. Say it straight, she said. What does anticipatory mean here? It means a mirror that moves before you do. She watched the screen without speaking. The fluorescents hummed their flat ecclesiastical note above us. I smelled warmed dust and the faint iodine brine of my cuffs, stiff with sea mist, from last night's walk to the intake pipes. We began the layered analysis, the kind of investigative scaffolding that has saved me from error more times than talent ever has. I mapped the signal in time and frequency first, then in space using array geometry, then in resonance, looking for signatures consistent with any known organism or device. Spectrograms gave us the picture of sound over time. Resonance mapping, identifying natural vibrational modes, tells you what cavities or structures could plausibly generate those frequencies. In animals, that means skull and sinus and lung. In machines, hull and pipe. In oceans, thermoclines and seafloor shelves. The map came back nonsense. The peaks matched the spacing of human vowels, E, A, O, each defined by characteristic distances between formants, but the inferred cavity size was wrong. At 3,000 meters, the pressure collapses air and compresses biological tissue. You don't get stable air-filled resonators. The math implied a throat the size of a room, yet molded in water. A throat without air is not a throat. I felt a ridiculous urge to apologize to the equations. Could be your pattern matching, Rao said, not unkindly. Brains love faces in clouds, voices in wind. I designed a test to insult that part of my brain long ago, I said. I randomized segments, inverted others, hid controls among decoys, then ran our classification algorithm blind. The software has no concept of names or fear. It measures spectral distances and votes. It returned the same decision a human ear would. Vowel clusters, statistically overrepresented, arranged in patterns implausible for noise. She rubbed at a tired place between her eyebrows. What if someone's spoofing the arrays, broadcasting ultrasound from a drone? We're on a naval station. Pranks happen in uniforms too. Then the direction finding would converge on a transmitter, I said. I pulled up the beamformer, a calculation that estimates where a sound comes from by comparing how it hits multiple sensors. The solution jittered like a compass near a magnet, then resolved into something worse than a location. A volume, a swelling sphere between the arrays. No hardware at its center, no anomaly on the bathymetric chart. A piece of the ocean itself seething in frequency bands that drew the shape of my mouth. The day stretched thin. We recorded new baselines, shut the arrays down, rebooted. We swapped cables, reseated preamps, resealed waterproof housings until the skin on my fingers bit with salt. Each procedural act was a liturgy. Repeat the ritual correctly, and the god of error reveals itself. But the god did not appear. Only the water answering. At noon, a supply truck rattled the loading bay. The interruption made our laboratory sound suddenly smaller, like a throat constricting. I waved for quiet and put the room into still. Stillness is not silence. It is a controlled collapse of variables. HVAC off, Hallway door propped. Staff notified. The only sound left was the ocean's infrasonic heartbeat. So low you feel it more than hear it. A slow barometric pressure on the bones. Talk to it, Rao said, half joking, and then flushed when she heard herself. I mean, if it's responsive. I dislike anthropomorphism in labs. It invites sloppy thinking. Yet I am a field primate with a nervous system optimized for voices. I stood at the console, keyed the mic, and said the most unscientific sentence of my career. If you can predict me, you already know what I'm going to say. We waited. The spectrogram rolled on, its waterfall of colors cascading into the past. At first, there was only the usual undersea tapestry, low geologic rumbles, the fray of distant surf, clicks like hailstones when sediment shifted along a slope far offshore. Then a filament appeared. It drew itself up the display with the timidity of capillary action. A formant, another, a third. They arranged themselves in the mouth position for my first vowel before I spoke it. My scalp tightened in that old mammalian way, muscles vestigial and embarrassed to be seen. I said my name once quietly. The ocean printed the shape, a fraction of a second early, and then laid a second, fuller impression over it, when the air in my throat finally complied. Rao swore, a small unlit word. Could a feedback loop? No loop, I said. No path. My mouth had not yet opened when the first formant rose. Feedback requires an output feeding an input that returns to the output. Microphone to speaker to microphone. Here the output was late, the input was ahead. A mirror that moves first. The test continued. I asked it for numbers, then nonsense syllables, then the alphabet shuffled. The anticipations were not perfect. It missed, stuttered, guessed. But the misses taught me more than the hits. It predicted best the phrases I use frequently in logs and lectures. The cadence of a professional lifetime. It faltered with words I rarely speak. I began to understand. It was not reading me in the moment. It was reading me in aggregate, as if the ocean had recorded my voice across years of coastal work. Field briefings shouted over surf, refit instructions, the small talk scientists make when the sea keeps them honest, and was now playing a composite forward, an average of who I am when I speak. At 14:30, the fisherman's radio crackled on the auxiliary channel we keep for courtesy checks. He sounded embarrassed to report voices in the nets, which he described as the kind of chatter you hear when a bar goes quiet and somebody says your name. He asked if our machines could be interfering with his sonar buoys. I told him, in the voice I reserve for federal forms and frightened people, that environmental conditions sometimes refract radio and sound in odd ways, particularly in fog. I instructed him gently to avoid the shelf margin until morning. Then I turned the radio off and wrote down the exact phrasing he used, because it matched mine. We took a break in the corridor. The stairwell chimed underfoot as if it were a bell, and we were clappers. The concrete sweated salt. The slip windows cut the fog into strips of pallid flesh. You look like you want it to be real, Rao said, not accusing, just reading my posture. I want it to be explainable, I said. Real is a lesser standard than explainable. Because if it isn't explainable, she said, it's superstition. Because if it isn't explainable, I corrected, then the tools we trust to draw the line between the real and the wished for need retooling. I paused, and I'm too old to be trained again. Back inside, I wrote a late afternoon log entry and then deleted it, then wrote it again with fewer adverbs, then deleted that too. The log I kept was clinical, times, amplitudes, phase errors. The log I did not keep would have read, I felt listened to, not eavesdropped upon, not a thief at the window, but attended to, the way a person who loves you attends to your breath while you sleep, counting the rise and fall for comfort or warning. As evening drew over the station, the building made its settling noises, ducts cooling, metal contracting with soft pings like rain reversed. I ran a final check, the ritual last look, which I have never once omitted in 22 years. The anticipatory traces were weaker now, as though fatigue were a property not only of muscles, but of water masses. I pictured the water column like a lung depleted of air, then chastised myself for the metaphor. There is no lung, there is no throat, there is only a medium behaving as if it were a body. Tomorrow, we deploy a dedicated array beyond 3,000 meters, I told Rao. Autonomous, isolated power, independent telemetry. If it anticipates us there, we will have ruled out Edelweiss and Eprank and Eagle and E-ship. We will have to consider new categories, she laughed once without amusement. Like what? The sea learning you? I will not write that sentence, I said, but I will test the consequence of it. We shut the lab down in stages to protect the data from voltage sags. Storage first, then preamps, then displays. The fluorescence went last. Darkness filled the foam wedges and gave them the look of a vast, gilled creature asleep. I pressed my ear to the door before opening it, old field habit in noisy ports, and heard nothing but the low arterial wind that a concrete building keeps for itself. Outside, the fog had begun to thin. The ocean resumed its visible size, which is to say, it resumed lying. Waves shouldered the base of the cliff with a patience that felt like counsel rather than force. I stood a moment longer than needed and let the breath of the place enter me. The iodine, the metal, the cold. Back in my quarters, I tried to imagine tomorrow as protocol rather than pilgrimage. Winch cables loaded, relay lights blinking, depth readouts scrolling steady, the first telemetry packet cracking open like ice. I tried not to imagine the alternative, an answering voice at depth, speaking first. I failed. The anticipations I had measured all day now colonized my private thought. I found myself listening to my own silence to see if it would arrive early. When I finally lay down, the old building exhaled. The mattress took my weight with a sound like paper being folded. I closed my eyes and, to lull myself, recited the deployment checklist in the cadence of prayer. Somewhere below the cliff, a volume of water was arranging itself into the shape of my vowels. An organ without flesh, rehearsing. I slept poorly and woke before the alarm, already phrasing the command string I would send at dawn. If the ocean intended to speak first, tomorrow we would give it the cleanest channel yet. The next morning arrived sodden with rain. The fog had lifted, but only to make room for a darker ceiling of cloud, as though the sky itself had been pulled closer to the station. The cliffs spat back spray that left the concrete corridors slick underfoot. By the time I reached the lab, my cuffs clung wet against my ankles. We powered up the arrays at 06 wow. Protocol demanded fresh baselines after any overnight shutdown, a practice I performed with the reverence of an oath. The graphs on the monitors steadied into the familiar architecture of ocean sound. Infrasonic rumbles from the continental shelf, the staccato of shrimp beds, the slow lament of a whale. For a few moments I allowed myself the illusion that yesterday had been an aberration. Then the whisper began. It was faint at first, no louder than the brush of breath across a microphone diaphragm. The spectrogram painted it as a thin, trembling filament. I slowed the playback, layered filters to reduce the surrounding noise, and the contour sharpened. What emerged was not a single vowel, but a chain. Subtle rises and falls that carried the cadence of respiration, then something closer to syllables. Random turbulence, Rao said immediately. She leaned across the console, her hands braced, trying to pin the data down with skepticism alone. The ocean is full of patterns we mistake for meaning. Pareidolia, same as hearing words in static. Her objection was rational and therefore worth dismantling with equal rationality. I overlaid the sequence against the resonance models of human breath and speech. The spacing matched too cleanly, the intervals between the pulses arranged like the gaps between spoken words. I pointed to the peaks. This is not turbulence. These are formants in sequence, vowels stretched across a subsonic throat. Noise does not assemble itself into grammar. She pressed her lips together, unwilling to concede. You're anthropomorphizing, projecting. Then the math is anthropomorphizing as well, I said. Equations don't dream. Still, a part of me recoiled from the admission. To call the signal structured was to step one rung down from science into narrative, and I despised narrative where data should be sufficient. Yet the pattern was there, as undeniable as a heartbeat on an ECG trace. That night, I dreamt of voices suspended in water. Not words exactly, but a chorus of exhalations, as though thousands of lungs had been pressed flat beneath the waves. I woke to fog plastered against the barracks window, so close it seemed to be breathing against the glass.